Good afternoon. I'm Frenchie Brewer, PR coordinator in the African American Studies program, and welcome to the College of Arts and Sciences summer webinar series. This is the fourth in the series, ranging in topics from big data to teaching theater and dance in the time of COVID to today's topic, the Rollin Sisters, and it's titled Sins of Omission, the Rollin Sisters and the South Carolina Suffrage Movement. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. And while much has been written about the South Carolina suffrage movement, little of nothing has been written about women of color during that period. But today we're going to be enlightened and informed about the prolific works of the Rollin Sisters. Today's webinar host is Dr. Valinda Littlefield, Associate Professor of History here at USC. Dr. Littlefield specializes in late 19th and 20th century African American history. Her current research focuses on African American rural Southern school teachers during the Jim Crow era. She is also the former director of the African American Studies program and my former boss. And before Dr. Littlefield begins, there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions of Dr. Littlefield at the end of her presentation. So get ready with your questions. And now I present you some and introduce to others, my colleague and friend, Dr. Valinda Littlefield.
Thank you, Frenchie. Hello and welcome. And before I get started, I would like to thank a few people. One is my colleague, Tom Brown, Burl Dakers with ETV, Kat Allen with Historic Columbia, and Marjorie Sproul-Wheeler, my former colleague. I'd also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for inviting me. And I'd like to thank the people who have made this possible. I want to start out by painting a picture of the period we're talking about to give you a feel of the space the Rollin sisters find themselves in. And the snippets I'm about to share with you, I want you to keep those in mind while you're listening to the rest of the presentation. And I promise to come back to them. I will try not to take you upstream and leave you. This is about a minute and a half. Bear with me. This is from Tara Hunter's book, To Joy My Freedom, one of my favorite books I use when I'm teaching this particular period. In the spring of 1866, Julie Tillery journeyed by foot to Atlanta with her 2 young children in tow. Like the thousands of other newly free people pouring into the city during Reconstruction, they had no earthly belongings except the tattered clothes on their back. Tillery had been sent word that her brother Paul and his wife and children had relocated to Atlanta recently. Unlike most other free people who arrived without kin, Tillery was fortunate to have her brother's family and could share their cramped quarters and food. One of Tillery's first concerns upon her arrival was to visit the office of the Freedmen's Bureau. She wanted assistance in locating her husband, John Robinson, who had been separated from her during the war. Robinson and Tillery had been owned by 2 different masters and lived separately on neighboring plantations. When the war broke out and slaveholders began fleeing for safe territory to escape invasion by the Union Army, Robinson refused to accompany his master and fled. For a while, Tillery would hear occasional news about her husband, that he was hiding out in the county, waiting for the right opportunity to retrieve her and the children. But no such opportunity ever came. The news gradually petered out and Tillery lost contact. She had no idea if Robinson was alive or dead. When Tillery found the Freedmen's Bureau office, she encountered Northern missionaries and Union Army officials busily tending to the business of helping destitute families find shelter, food, clothing, and work. Her eyes fixed on a missionary woman who was herself overwhelmed by the task before her and the gravity of her responsibilities. Apparently in awe of the seeming contradiction of destitution and determination surrounding her, the missionary pondered the state of affairs. She asked Tillery a question that had been burning in her mind ever since her arrival in the South and her firsthand observation of the monumental changes brought about by Union victory. Why would you want to leave the certainties and comforts of your master's plantation where subsistence was guaranteed for uncertainties before you? Without a moment's pause, Tillery replied, to joy my freedom. All right. What you see is a power struggle during this particular time period. Who should control the South? What should be the status of former slaves? And what labor system should replace slavery? Central to that national debate over Reconstruction, efforts of Southern African Americans to breathe full meaning into their newly acquired freedom by prodding all Americans at their first attempt to live up to the noble ideals of the Constitution. And so Tillery is part, in 1866, is part of this group forcing Americans to live up to those ideals. She wants to enjoy her freedom. For the first time, she is able to do that. Frances Rollin, in 1867, age 22, sued the owner of a steamer who was taking her from Charleston to Beaufort because he refused her a first-class seat. She sued him for $250, and she won with the help of Martin Delaney. We'll talk a little bit more about him in question and answer period, but that starts a long relationship. She ends up writing his biography. Violence is another space, is another part of that space that the Rollin sisters and others found themselves. In 1870, you have testimony and excerpts from the KKK hearings in South Carolina. Henry Johnson was a bricklayer and a plasterer. He was also very active in politics, and he was threatened with death by the Klan. He fled his home in Winsboro, South Carolina, and moved to Columbia. Apart from the meeting, and these are questions that's asked of him, apart from the meetings, what is the sense of personal security by colored people in their own homes? Do they feel safe? And Johnson says, no, sir. They keep moving away from there because they keep whipping and slashing them at night. So this is the environment the Rollin sisters will find themselves in. The five sisters, who were they? What do their stories add to the South Carolina and the U.S. national suffrage movement histories? What do their stories reveal about the experiences of middle-class African Americans during the Reconstruction era, especially in South Carolina? The five of them: Frances Ann was born in 1845. She died in 1901. Charlotte was born in 1847, dying in 1928. And Catherine, 1851 to 1876. Louise, 1858 to 1921. And Florence, 1861 to 1934. And we've seen several dates for Florence. We've even seen an 1858 date for Florence. I'm going with the 1861 until I can prove differently. Their parents, William Rollin, of French extraction, Gatewood says. This is Willard Gatewood, who writes one of the first articles on the Rollin sisters. His ancestors leave this area when we have the Haitian Revolution. He is a wood and lumber dealer. He owned slaves. We know at least 12 slaves, and valuable real estate in that Charleston area. He often traveled north to purchase goods for his business, and he hired Irish workers he was sought out by politicians because of his influence with those Irish workers. So whenever they wanted to convince the Irish to vote for them, they would go see William Rollin. Parents, Margaretta Rollin, we know very little about her. She is one of those people who just disappears. She doesn't disappear, but there's not a lot of records and writings about her. She is also a free person of color. She lived with her husband and children in a mansion on America Street in Charleston, and that's in the eastern section of Charleston. And that section has been in the news because Henry Lawrence purchased the property in the late 1700s, and by the 1960s, it's predominantly African American, and so there are some issues going on now with that particular area. The sisters moved to Columbia by 1868, we know. We think they possibly rent property on the corner of Sumter and Senate Street. The 1871 description of the house in New York articles fits the property. In 1851, the house is owned by Maxie Gregg family. Gregg dies in 1862. He is a Confederate military person. And the house is sold to the Montague family at some point in the 1850s. Agnes Montague Caldwell, who is a widow, sells the house in 1872 to Senator George McIntyre. We've seen McIntyre, middle initial F and W, for $6,200. Within a couple of months, he sells it to Catherine for the same amount that he purchased it. In April 1875, she sells the house, William Dowell, and I'll show you a newspaper clipping showing that. And this is an image of the house. You'll see the arrow. The Episcopal Church is across the street. It's on the corner of Sumter and Senate. This is the Daily Phoenix in 1875 talking about the sale of the house. She's called Katie. And you will be able to get this later on and look at it in greater detail. We have two images of Frances. We have absolutely no images of the other sisters. We haven't found them, so at least I haven't found them, nor have some of my friends found the images. But this is Frances Ann Rollin Whipper, and this is in the New York digital collection. Frances Ann was called Frank. She attended private school in Charleston, and then she attended the Quaker School for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. She returned to Charleston in 1865 and taught for the Freedmen's Bureau. She and Catherine also tried to start a school in Charleston. And this is also when, I'll talk a little bit about the steamer is the pilot boy, and I've talked earlier about that. When she files the suit, and Martin Delaney is a lawyer and works with her on this particular suit for the Freedmen Bureau. He is employed by the Freedmen Bureau at this particular time. She writes, he encourages her or convinces her to write his biography. And he knows that there are publishers in Boston who are interested in his biography. Martin Delaney became the highest commissioned African-American in the Union Army. And he's from that Philadelphia area, comes to South Carolina and doesn't leave. And so she goes to Boston to write his biography, and she spends about 8 months in Boston. And it is in Boston that she meets, that she goes to lectures. So in her diary, she keeps a diary, and in her diary of 1867, she talks about the kinds of lectures that she would have gone to. But she also is escorted by Richard Greener, along with some other people of color while she's there. In her diary, she finds Greener a little cold, a little aloof, so she doesn't see him as a permanent partner in life. And she does, at some point at a lecture, there is a gentleman who is a minister, and in her diary, she only uses the initial P. But she is very enamored with Mr. P. And he's an eloquent speaker. He believes in women's rights. He's charismatic, and this is the kind of man she's looking for, and she finds that in attorney William J. Whipper. She returns to South Carolina from Boston. She is employed by Whipper. He convinces her to come back and work for him when she finishes the biography. And he's recently been selected to the South Carolina legislature, and they marry within a few months, September 1868. They have 5 children, 3 live to adulthood. And by 1880, several places say both of them moved to DC with all 5 children, but they only talk about the 3 who survive, Ionia, Lee, and Winifred. And later on, she works as a clerk for her friend Frederick Douglass in the Recorder of Deeds in DC. Winifred, we know, became a teacher. She dies early of tuberculosis. Lee received a law degree from Howard and became an actor, a very popular actor in the 1940s and 1950s. Aonia attended Howard Medical School. She became a doctor, and she also established a home for girls, especially pregnant girls, and to be more specific. And that home is still in existence. It has evolved, but there's a short video on the home. If you're interested, if you just Google it, it'll come up. It's a very fascinating video on Aonia's work, and she is still very much beloved by people in DC. In 1892, Frances became ill while campaigning, and she died of tuberculosis in Beaufort in 1901. We know she comes back to Beaufort, where Whipper is living, and she dies in 1901. Charlotte, who was called Lottie, attended private schools in Charleston and later the Quaker School for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. In March 1869, she testified before the State House of Representatives in favor of passing women's suffrage legislation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that toward the latter part of this conversation. She and her sisters organized a women's rights convention in Columbia in December, and attendees, again, black, white, male, female. I'm going to give you some names shortly. Active in the American Women's Suffrage Association, and in 1870, she's elected the secretary of the South Carolina Women's Group. In February 1871, receives a charter for the first South Carolina branch of the American Women's Suffrage Association from Lucy Stone, the president. She became the president of the South Carolina branch, and in 1871, she leads a rally at the State House to promote women's suffrage. And in 1872, the legislatures are asked to amend the state constitution to include women's suffrage. And the Rollin Sisters, Whipper, Chamberlain, all of them are very, very active in trying to get this passed. It does not pass. And I'll talk a little bit more about that toward a little bit later. She served as a delegate to the National American Women's Suffrage Association Conference in 1872. Catherine, or Katie, attended private schools in Charleston, also later the Quaker School for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. And along with Charlotte, she also organized a women's rights convention. They all had a hand in it, but Catherine and Charlotte were the most, I would say, the most active. Catherine was frequently seen with Senator McIntyre, who was a white native of Charleston and the owner of the Colleton Gazette. After selling the Columbia Senate Sumter Street House, she possibly moved to Florida with McIntyre, but she died shortly thereafter. She's dead by 1876. Louise, we know very little about her. I'm hoping Burl will find lots of more information on her so that we'll have more information to share. Ms. Dakers is working on a wonderful documentary on South Carolina suffrage movement. Florence is the youngest sister, and she basically, writings and things like that, I have not found them, and so we're still looking for those. One of the sayings is "gone anywhere but here." That is certainly with the exodusters who leave around Reconstruction time. But you certainly get people like the Rollin sisters having to leave. Charlotte and Louise settled with their mother in Brooklyn, New York, we know. Again, we don't have very much on them after settling in Brooklyn, New York. That's more research to be done, another thread to pull. William and Frances and the children moved to DC, but William doesn't stay very long. He moves back to South Carolina shortly thereafter, and he appears in the 1895 South Carolina Convention, where he makes a passionate plea for South Carolina leaders not to disenfranchise African Americans. When we think about the impact of the Rollin sisters and the suffrage movement, and when I talk about sins of omission, one of the things that we often talk about, and when we look at documentaries or read things about the suffrage movement, is it is heavily focused on the North and the Midwest and sometimes the West. They say very little about the South. And so what the Rollin Sisters allows us to do is to look at political activism outside of those areas. They also provide us with a much longer timeline of activism. They provide us with a glimpse of intersection of race and gender cooperation that is not seen in the later suffrage movement timeline. This is the Daily Phoenix, August 29th, 1867. And when we talk about civil rights, you know, that sin of omission again, and this is with Francis and the suit of the pilot boy. And this is the South bragging on the fact that in the North, in Buffalo, New York, there is this person of African descent who wants a sleeping car, and he is told he can't have a sleeping car. And another Caucasian, basically later on when you're reading, it says, you know, I don't want to sleep near him, is what you find out much later on. And so this person is bragging that that would never happen in South Carolina, because, you know, Mrs. Rollins sued and won $270. So we don't have that kind of stuff in South Carolina. The Sumter Watchman, again, the omission leaves out, you have newspaper articles that allow us to see not only local, statewide interest, but also national interest. And this is the Sumter talking about, there's a meeting of women in 1871. And again, looking at those people's, the listing, this is at the Whippers residence. They're talking about people like F.J. Moses, who was the secretary. They're talking about Ransier. They're talking about Martha Schofield's name will pop up in some of these as well. You will see her. But again, officers are elected, Governor Scott. And so men, this is male and female cooperation, and that's extremely important to see that. I would argue that Marjorie Sproul and I were talking about this, but one of the arguments is that at no other time does South Carolina have such participation of men in powerful positions and being very forceful about women having the right in their voices, about women having the right to vote. At no other time do you get this kind of cooperation. This is the Edgefield Advertiser. Again, them talking about Miss Rollins. The other thing, when you're reading these, you have to go back and double check things because they just say Mrs. Rollins. Well, there are 5 of them, so you have to figure out which Mrs. Rollins they're talking about. Here is Martha Schofield, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Martha toward the end. But here's Martha, who is at this meeting. They do invite her to the very first meeting. And this one talks about Chamberlain, again, Moses, Whipper, all of those who are extremely important in the South Carolina government. Lottie became the first delegate from South Carolina to attend a National Women's Suffrage Convention. They, again, received the first charter in South Carolina for the suffrage organization. And Frances, remember I talked about the fact that they all are involved in different ways. The way Frances was involved was she promoted the movement by writing articles for publications. And she was also the editor of the Beaufort Tribune. And so she often published articles and stories about meetings and happenings of the suffrage movement. So let's talk a little bit about Charlotte. I want to share Charlotte's quote, a quote that Charlotte made, and this would be a quote that she's making in 1872. I'm sorry, this is 1870. She's in Charleston, and she says, "We ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right based on the ground that we are human beings, and as such entitled to all human rights. While we concede that women's ennobling influence should be confined chiefly to home and society, we claim that public opinion has had a tendency to limit women's sphere to too small a circle, And until a woman has the right of representation, this will last and other rights will be held by an insecure tenure. Schofield, who later owned, remember she is in that early movement, that Reconstruction movement, and once by the 1890s, late 1880s, 1890s, when the South Carolina suffrage movement is picking up steam again with Virginia Young, Martha Schofield is certainly a part of this. And she is one of the few white women who saw the need for including African-American women in the movement. And this is a quote from Martha Schofield. She's writing a letter to Governor Blease in 1912. Women can only advance when both colors accept it. When Black men received the ballot, they received it with a sense of self-respect, a consciousness of manhood, while the women, denied this stimulus, still felt they must remain in the background. However, there was an even more crucial consideration for Black women than that of the ballot: their exploitation as sex objects by white men. Social equality, she meant inequality, will stop when white men cease to be the fathers of colored children. So Martha kept true to the belief that Black and white women should work together for a common cause for suffrage. When we look at those sins of omission, the words and deeds promoting racism by the mid-1870s got many South Carolinians to participate in the overthrow of an inclusive and progressive era government. And the cost to the state included decades of struggle in a host of areas, including the suffrage movement. And so where we see in the beginning of Tillery trying to enjoy her freedom, so were the Rollin sisters trying to enjoy their freedom in a different element. Although they were free women of color, they still, during that particular time period of enslaved, when we're thinking of the enslaved period, they did not share all of the freedoms. And like John and many others, at the end of Reconstruction, they too fear for their safety and have to escape the state of South Carolina. When we think of the suffrage movement and the struggles of the suffrage movement, we know that South Carolina does not approve of this amendment. And they finally approve it in 1969. And there is an oops, they forget to follow through. And so it's 1973 before it actually reaches the South Carolina law books. And that's because one of the women suffrage, Keller, calls the office and says, West office, the governor, and says, look, this isn't on the books. And so they get to it and correct that mistake. We also have the memories and certainly the writings of a Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who argued that we know how to take care of our women and we don't need anything like a suffrage amendment. Ben Tillman was a staunch anti-suffragist. And so, along with several other Southerners, but for South Carolina, he was one of the most active. And so when you get racist ideals about suffrage, that it will allow African Americans the right to vote, and we can't have that, and you get this kind of environment, there is no wonder that the suffrage movement suffers, even with people like Young, who carry on a very hard task. But when we look at sins of omission, we have to remember that Reconstruction period. And we have to remember that this is a progressive period, not only in the suffrage movement and other rights for women, but we also have to think about education and other things that came out of that 1868 convention. So the sins of omission create a disappearance of the role of women like the Rollin Sisters, like Martha Schofield, and the role that they played in bringing people together. And I'm going to stop here because I know most of you have possibly have lots of questions. Hopefully I can answer most of those questions. If I can't, there's probably people out there who can answer those questions. And so let's go with questions.
I believe Frenchie is coming back on momentarily to go through the questions, but we did have a question from Carol Temple asking, can you post Charlotte's quote or tell us where to find it? And perhaps we can include it in an email that we'll send out to attendees afterward, but perhaps you could read it again for those who would like to hear it right now.
Certainly. This is Charlotte, who is speaking at the 1870 convention in Charleston. And she says, we ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right based on the ground that we are human beings, and as such entitled to all human rights. While we concede that women's ennobling influence should be confined chiefly to home and society, we claim that public opinion has had a tendency to limit women's sphere to too small a circle. And until a woman has the right of representation, this will last and other rights will be held by an insecure tenure. And that certainly proves true, because when you look at the case of Pitchfork of Ben Tillman's son, Tillman Jr., and his wife, who deeds the children over to Tillman, to his father, because Ben is considered not a suitable parent. And so there is a suit to get the children, by the mother to get the children back. And she wins that suit. And that particular suit convinces a lot of women in South Carolina to join the suffrage movement. We do have documentation of that. But again, when a husband can deed the children over without the wife's permission, women were in very precarious situations, and they recognized that. And that was recognized in 1868 by those men at the 1868 convention who wanted to give women more rights.
All right, so our next question is from Paul Gabarini, and he asks, can you name the private schools that they attended in Charleston?
Yes, probably not. I do know that they would have been a Catholic school, and I'll have to look that up. My memory is gone from which school it was, but there were Catholic schools in Charleston during this particular time that they could have attended. And because of their status, you have to remember that William, their father, has lots of contracts with Columbia, with the city of Charleston. He is very much respected and well liked, and he has white allies. And so free people of color in Charleston, very similar to when you think of a New Orleans, have certain rights that other states don't offer. And so you certainly see free people of color in that Charleston area having access to private schools. And I will get the name of the school if I can.
All right, and here's a question from Timothy Hicks, very close to one that I have. Why do you think the Grimke sisters get attention while the Rollins sisters don't? And how do they get along with their white counterparts?
How did the Grimke sisters get along with their white counterparts?
The Rollin sisters.
The Rollin sisters get along with them. The Rollin sisters, their white counterparts, they got along quite well with them. They didn't necessarily like Stanton. They thought she was a little on the flashy, not the flashy side, but they didn't trust her. when you think about their work, and I'll come back to the Grimke sisters, when you think about their lives in the Columbia area, again, we have to keep in mind that these are middle class to upper middle class raised African American women, free women of color, and they claim that. And they claim their French ancestry more so than their African ancestry many times. And so what you get are class tensions. In some newspaper articles, we see that they write about the fact that white women are trying to get on the good side of the Rollin sisters, and the Rollin sisters are having nothing to do with it. And it's because the Rollin sisters don't see them in their class, and they see them as a lower class, and they're not interested in dealing with them. They're not interested in, and we have their writings, their quotes, they're not interested in dealing with ignorant blacks either. And so they are very class consciousness. And so they get along, like Martha Schofield had a very great relationship. She is the first one that we know of that they invite to be a part of this movement when it starts. And so they do get along with certain we know they get along with certain white women. They certainly loved Governor Scott's wife. They thought she was unpretentious, she was down to earth. So they tended to like women in a certain class, but who didn't put on airs and pretend to be what they were not. As far as the Grimke sisters, you know, I think it's part of who writes history. It's part of, we often talk about, you know, the old African proverb is, until the lion tells his story, we really will not know the full story of the hunt. And so it is always the people who have access to papers, the people who have access to publishing, who get to write the first stories. And the Grimke sisters are certainly a wonderful story that should be written. They were very powerful in their own right. They were very conscious about racial issues. They raise their nephews when their brother dies, who has children by a black woman in South Carolina. They send for those boys and they raise them. And Charlotte Fortin ends up marrying one of them. That's the Grimke connection. And so certainly the Grimke sisters deserve to be written about, but again, because of race, because of, I would argue mainly because of race, because of our thoughts about that Reconstruction period, we don't want to really write about the good things that happened or the progressive things that happened during Reconstruction. For decades, we only wanted, most people, I mean, Du Bois and others tried to write a different version. But the people who had access to the pen and the publishers only wanted to write about the negative things. And so you lose the Charlotte, you lose the Rollins.
Interesting about the classism. So we have a congratulations, Val, great job, from Georgiana Burton, who also asks, how long have you been studying these women?
Oh, you know, I talk a little bit about the Rollin sisters in my class when I teach the Reconstruction period, but I had not gone into the depth that I've had to go into. And I must give that credit to Ms. Dakers, who pulled me into participating in the ETV documentary. And so it meant I had to do some research. It meant I had to rely on Burl and Catherine Allen and others in finding information on the Rollins. It has been a joy. And so for the last few months, I have been trying to find material and talking to people and sharing material. As I said, last night I was talking to Marjorie, but sharing material and reading up on things. And you can find them in snippets. Like I can find a couple of the Rollin sisters in Bernard Power's book on Black Charlestonians, Rosalind Turborg Penn's book on the struggle, on the struggle. You get the movement. You can find some information there. Gatewood writes the longest article Willard Gatewood writes the longest article on them, and so they're in notes. I'm able to find materials and go and find newspaper articles and those things. Also, the New York Herald and the New York Sun, you end up with reporters being told that you must interview the Rollin sisters. And so they go interview them, and these reporters are from the North with their racism as well. You know, the paper darkies talking about slow and ignorant darkies. I mean, they're not enlightened from the North about African Americans. They have their own perceptions about African Americans. But when they get to the House on Sumter and Senate, you know, their first impression is these folks they're rich. That's the first impression, because they're looking at, you know, $1,000 piano. They're looking at paintings, and they're looking at the carpet and all sorts of markings of upper middle class. And then the Rollin sisters start to talk to them, and it is evident that they are very knowledgeable about poetry. They're very about the poets of the time. They're very knowledgeable about the environment. They just have a range of knowledge about almost any subject and can talk to these reporters about anything. And so the reporters come away thinking, you know, they're the cat's meow. They really are. You know, one of the reporters say, had they been Caucasian, you know, they would be, you know, the Belles of New York. But because they are of the darker hue, this is who they are. But they give them credit for being, you know, very intelligent, very well spoken, very learned. So those are the kinds of things that you get, this juxtaposition of them coming with their image of African Americans and then meeting the Rollin sisters and that turning on its head.
Wow, the more things change, the more they stay the same, it seems.
Yes.
So Joanne Zeiss asks, was Columbia the center of this activity, or do we know of any women working for suffrage during Reconstruction in Charleston or Greenville or anywhere else in South Carolina?
Yeah, Columbia is definitely the center of this. They certainly move around in that Charleston area because that is home for them. But Columbia is the center. The salon of the House on Senate is considered the Republican headquarters. It is where all the issues are discussed. It is where you will find the governor and his wife, Governor Scott at the time. It is where you will find Ranzier and his wife, Whipper. It is where you will find all the leaders and anyone who wants to know about what's happening and to discuss the issues and to make changes. You will find them in the salon. And so this is the hub, and the newspaper accounts talk about that fact. The newspaper article, the New York Sun and the New York Herald also talk about that. And so yes, Columbia is definitely the hub. And it's because of the Rollin sisters.
Okay, and this from Megan Kane. She wants to know if there is any relationship the Rollin sisters had with the HBCUs in South Carolina.
When you think of Frances, we do know, according to Bernard Powers, the Black Charlestonians, she does teach for a short time at Avery Institute, which trains the teachers and ministers. And so Cardoza becomes the principal there. There's money raised through the Freedmen Bureau. So we do know that they are definitely involved with Avery Institute. By the time they get to Columbia, I don't know if they were involved with Allen and Benedict later on. That I don't know. That's a thread that I'll have to look at.
All right, this next question is from Laura Walliver. Where are the Rollin sisters papers archived?
That's, you know, Lee Whipper, who became the actor, his papers are at the Smithsonian. You have the Daniel L. Murray papers in Madison. Also, we know has, and I tried desperately to get a copy of a typed letter that, Francis sent him detailing her life, because he was going to put her in the Encyclopedia of the Colored, which never got published by him. He died before it got published, and actually that version never gets published within the last decade. It was published by Henry Louis Gates and Elizabeth Higginbotham. But the Murray papers has some materials, but their papers are scattered. One of the great granddaughters writes a book, Carol Aoun. She has some materials. There is a diary, Sisters, We Are Your Sisters. Dorothy Sterling publishes the 1867 version of the diary. We don't know how many other diaries are out there. We know Miss Aoun has, we think, the 1867 diary, but the other diaries, we don't know if they're in the archives somewhere. So that's another thread that we're trying to find, because Frances wrote very detailed information about her days. So that's how we know about Richard Greener and her thinking of him as being aloof and on the cold side. But she, that's how we know about her living in Boston and the kinds of things she did in Boston, but also her living, the family she lived with, who were the Baileys, who were friends of her mother and her father. She rented a room with them. And so we have that kind of information from the diary, but again, just snippets. Like many African Americans, the papers aren't housed in any one location. They're papers here and there. And that's what makes it difficult to pull together their story.
Sure. So here's an interesting question from Carol Jackson, who's asking, is there ever a documented era when white women may have been willing to sacrifice Black women's voting rights to obtain their own voting rights? And were there open rifts among these women? Okay,
yes. By the time you get to the 1890s, that rift has started, because Reconstruction is trying to put everything back. The end of Reconstruction, 1876, 1877, is trying to put everything back in the box. And to some extent, many things are put back in the box, because we certainly get African-American men the right to vote being taken away from them. And so this begins this argument of, when African-American men get the right to vote in 1870, you have an argument, you have tension there, because many white women leaders, suffrage leaders, do not think that women should be left out. And they argue that educated white women like Lucy Stanton and Susan Anthony should have the right to vote, not ignorant Black men. And so that rift starts in 1870, and it doesn't do anything but grow. So by the time you get to the 1890s, you have, although African-American women continue to be involved in the suffrage movement, what you have are white women, now Northern white women. They argue in order to get Southern women to buy into the suffrage movement, we can't argue for Black women having the right to vote, because guess what? Their men have just been, their rights have been taken away from them. So we're not going to allow that to happen. And so then you have things like, an Ida B. Wells, who shows up for marches and being told, you can't march in the front. She's a staunch suffragist, and you have to go to the back of the line. So you have, and then, you have arguments with Anthony and them with Douglas, because Douglas always goes and argues for women having the right to vote. But when they're going south, you know, you can't take a Douglas with you. And so these are the kinds of tensions that are there. And so what you see after this cooperative period in Reconstruction for South Carolina is a split. And when I talked about Schofield, she literally is one of the few who sees the advantage of making sure Black women have the vote.
Okay. Well, here's a question from Carol Temple asking, is W.J. Whipper part of the Whipper family from Charleston?
Yes, W.J. Whipper is definitely part of that Whipper family. And he originates from, I want to say Philadelphia. His family were abolitionists. He too comes as part of that northern group who comes south during the Civil War and participates. And he ends up working for the Freedmen Bureau. He's one of the first to get a law degree, and then goes on to be elected for South Carolina. And therefore, yes, that is that same family.
Okay. You have touched on this question a little bit, and this one is from Paige Ivy asking about the best sources that you have found for discovering more about their stories, although you've said it's difficult, but where is the best place to try to find more information?
Well, the most concise story would be Willard Gatewood's article, and you can pull, there are PDFs all over the place. If you just Google it, JSTOR has it, but there are certainly PDFs that you can just download and read that particular article, and it will lead you, the endnotes will lead you to newspaper articles. The Women's Journal will certainly lead you to articles, short articles about the suffrage movement during this particular time period. And again, those are in that article, in that Gatewood article. The other place is, again, Rosalind Turborg Penn writes about the Rollin Sisters, and that's in the Darlene Clark Hine edited version. And I want to say we specialize in the wholly impossible, but it might be in her, it's actually in her Encyclopedia of African American Women. You will find the Rosalind Turborg Penn article. You will find them in the Bernard Powers, snippets of them in the Bernard Powers Black Charlestonians. You will also find snippets of them in William Drago's book on the Avery Institute. But the most concise writing about them is still the Gatewood article.
Good information, lots of disparate resources, but you can find it. So this is from LJ Cole asking, what have you found to be the biggest surprise in your research on the Rollin Sisters?
The biggest surprise, I guess the biggest surprise was Frances and tracking her children and her grandchildren. And I found them fascinating. And so, excuse me, I'm going to have to, especially Aonia, who becomes the doctor, and then Lee, who becomes a very, as I said, popular film star. And so one of the things that I want to look at, and they keep for their names, everything that I found them, it is Rollin Whipper. So they claim both parentage. And so that to me was was one of the best surprises. And the fact that they kept alive, even with the great-granddaughter Carol, is that they kept alive that activism. When you think about Aonia and the house for the girls, if you get a chance, I encourage you to look at that video. She also was a doctor at Tuskegee Institute for a while for the women. she's in DC as a doctor, and she raises money. She forms an organization or a group, an advisory board to raise money. And on that advisory board, one of the people I'm remembering is Mary McLeod, another very powerful woman out of Maysville, South Carolina, who raises money to buy that, to start this home for these girls. And it's a huge space. And to listen to one of the judges, and this would have been the 70s and 80s, talking about when girls come through her court and she sees something in them, she recommends them to this home because she knows they're going to deal with these girls from a holistic standpoint. And then they interview some of the girls who go on to do lots of great things, who came through that home. And so you have this long line of women and men, when you think of Lee, being activists and still looking at social justice and giving back to the community and especially to the race. And that was very rewarding. That was one of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed finding.
Okay, well, I think Thomas Brown, who is going to speak for a lot of us, where he's saying that he's learned a lot today. We have time for a few more questions. And one is from Thomas Brown, who is asking you to say something about why Frances Rollins chose Martin Delany among the various African-American leaders of the 1860s as a biography subject.
Great. He selects her when he works with her on the suit against the pilot. She tells him that she is a writer, that she is interested in furthering her career as a writer. That is what she wants to become, a writer. And so he is impressed by her. She is 22 at this point in her life, and he is very much impressed by her. And so he suggests to her that she write his biography, and he offers to pay her. That does not come through. He has lots of children, like many of them. And so balancing that budget sometimes becomes problematic. And so while she is in Boston, she takes on odd jobs of being a seamstress to make ends meet so that she can pay her rent and those kinds of things. But she does complete the biography. It is published, and they publish it under the name of Frank, which is what her family called her. And it's published under the name of Frank because the publishers didn't think that the audience would buy a book published by a woman with a woman's name as the author. And so they suggest Frank, and she's fine with that because that's what her family knows her as, and that's what they call her anyway. So Delany selects her.
Okay. Well, here's an interesting question, given the political times we're in, waiting on Joe Biden to name his vice president. Brian Robinson is asking, was there a particular political party driving women's suffrage in South Carolina, and how did the politics of Reconstruction provide space for a women's suffrage movement?
Okay, it is the Republican Party that is driving. It is the party of Lincoln that is driving the suffrage movement during this particular time. Whipper and all of them are Republican representatives. Remember, after Reconstruction, the overthrow is for the Democrats. And so when you're thinking about the Republican Party, you are thinking about Northerners. You are thinking about Southern African American men who would have had some education, and some who would not have had a lot of education. You're also thinking about Northern Black men, like a B.F. Randolph, who comes from Ohio, who is a minister who has earned his degree from Oberlin. So you're also thinking about a very learned group of African American men, and they're not threatened by women. And and they understand the importance of women and equality. And I think part of that comes out for the men who were enslaved, comes out of their understanding of the role women played in their survival. And I think for the men who were free, like a B.F. Randolph or Whipper, who come from the North, they come from families who were abolitionists, and the women are just as active as the men. So they don't come from families where the women are, you know, the little women who stay in the corner and mind the children. They come from seeing and interacting with very strong women, and so they're not threatened. They see the value that women bring to the table. And Whipper argues that Black women are the superior of Black men and white men. So, you know, it's that kind of conversations. You know, you can understand a Francis falling in love with a Whipper, somebody who thinks like that. So they're not threatened by strong women.
And look at how Black women are defining a lot of the political landscapes today.
Yes, still.
So here's I think our last question, and we'll wrap this up quite nicely, from Timothy Hicks. And he asks, can we expect a future book by Dr. Littlefield on these feisty and likable siblings?
Oh, I know that, you know, I'm still working on a book on Black women school teachers. But this one is also calling my name. So maybe I need to step back from all these other things that I'm doing, or cooperate with some of those friends of mine, and we come up with a nice volume on the Rollin Sisters. You know, keep this group looking for materials and see what happens, and come up with, you know, maybe USC Press would be interested in a nice edited volume on the Rollin Sisters. I like that. That is a possibility. Yes. I like sharing.
Very nice tease, and very, very informative lecture today, Dr. Littlefield. Thank you so much for this wonderful information, and I think we're all going to be scrambling trying to find out more about these amazing women.
Well, Frenchie, thank you so much, as usual, for your expertise and making this flow very smoothly. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Brian, thank you. He's in the back here, but he's been keeping things running. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And so as a reminder to all of our participants today, this is being recorded so that it will be available by email later this month. So keep your eyes out for that, and go to sc.edu/CAS webinars to view our past series. And as again, this will be up later this month, and check back later for more interesting series coming up. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.